Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's just think about who we're talking about when I talk about the just about managing. These are people who have a job but worry about their job security, who have a home but worry about paying the mortgage. We're helping people in a variety of ways. Of course, that includes raising the national living wage. It includes raising the personal tax allowance, which will take more people out of paying tax altogether and give a tax cut to people. And of course, we're committed to building more affordable homes. But what matters underneath all of this is ensuring that we have a strong economy. That's what the autumn statement was about yesterday.
To me, it makes sense, given the warning signals coming from the OBR report, to keep a little bit of firepower in the locker, to build a little bit of a reserve, so that if there is a slowdown next year, we've got enough capacity to support the economy, to protect jobs, to ensure that the economy can get through any headwinds it encounters. That's the approach I've taken.
Well, the Institute for Fiscal Studies is giving its reaction to the autumn statement in central London. Let's listen in.
Pre-budget reports over the years, as is illustrated actually in what we heard yesterday and the last few weeks, are quite a lot of things announced in recent budgets and autumn statements which were unannounced quietly yesterday and in the weeks leading up to it. Because the temptations for chancellors to use their 2 days to make too many headline-grabbing announcements is rather great. And as I said, along with colleagues from the Institute for Government and the Chartered Institute of Taxation, in a letter we sent to Mr. Hammond back in September recommending the abolition of one of the fiscal events, which should give us a chance to reduce the frequency of changes of direction, release resource for more consultation, produce higher quality legislation, and hopefully more effective legislation, and make life simpler for taxpayers. So let's hope all of that comes to pass. In any case, even with a full fiscal event, Mr. Hammond made a pretty good start, at least in the sense that it is genuinely quite thin, and he didn't do too much. Not too many rabbits being taken out of hats yesterday. But I think there were three big things we can take from yesterday. One, of course, was the downgrade in the economic forecast. That's the Office of Budget Responsibility's economic forecast, not the Treasury's, and the consequent downgrade in forecast living standards. The OBR think that national income in 2020-21 will be 30 billion lower than they projected back in March. That's equivalent to about £1,000 per household. Secondly, we have a new set of much looser fiscal rules than the ones we had before, and we're seeing a £10 billion surplus projected for 2019-20, turning into a £20 billion deficit that year. And thirdly, in terms of what Mr. Hammond decided, there was some pretty clear prioritisation. Most of what largesse he felt he had available, he used for additional investment spending on roads, housing, research and development, so to support the economy in the long run rather than paying to support the incomes of the just about managing, or indeed to support public services in the short run. That's the clear direction we got from him. So what about the forecasts and the public finances? Well, I think the first thing to say is we have, as we've said before, two independent organisations, the Bank of England doing monetary policy and the OBR doing the fiscal policy. And interestingly, their projections have diverged reasonably significantly. So earlier this month, the bank projected growth of 1.4, 1.5 and 1.6% in 2017, 2018 and 2019, whereas yesterday the OBR projected growth of 1.4, 1.7 and 2.1% in those years. That's quite a big difference. So overall, the bank forecasts GDP growth of 4.9% between now and the end of 2019, whereas the OBR thinks it'll be 5.8% over the same period. And that's a big difference. That's a sort of 20% difference in growth. It's especially striking given that if you look, for example, back to the March forecast of the OBR and the closest bank forecast, they're almost exactly the same as each other at that point. Further out as well, the OBR forecasts remain relatively robust after 2019, although, as they put it, when looking for information about government policy on exiting the EU in 2019, they were left, quote, little the wiser as regards the choices and trade-offs the government might make. So in the context of that uncertainty, the OBR had to make some fiscal forecasts, and in their view, borrowing will be 32 billion higher in 2019-20 and 2020-21 than they forecast back in March. About 10 billion of that is down to policy decisions, at least in the latter year. About 18 billion is down to changes in forecasting and modelling changes, including a significant chunk that's down to things we found out this year in terms of weaker revenues. And then there's a residual 4 billion from classification changes, which we would bore you with. I think it's important to say that 18 billion is not actually a terribly big change in forecasting over a 4-year period. There are certainly a number of occasions in which the forecasts have changed more than that 4 years out. The OBR put 15 of that 18 billion down to the Brexit vote. If it turns out that that is the effect on the public finance, that is a somewhat smaller hit than many forecasters were suggesting. And for the long run, the OBR say that productivity growth will return to trend by the mid-2020, so the projected economic hit from Brexit doesn't grow any further. Second important thing to note is that in the face of the deteriorating forecasts, Mr. Hammond didn't tighten fiscal policy, but nor did he do what his predecessor did, which was stick to previous spending plans. He actually loosened by an annual £10 billion or so, and he loosened in a rather specific way, mostly by increasing planned capital spending. Given the choice between jam today in the form of more money in people's pockets and jam tomorrow in the form of potential economic returns and greater investment, he went very clearly for jam tomorrow. And strikingly, he responded not at all to calls for more money for either the NHS or social care. I'm going to stick my neck out a bit and suggest that he probably won't be able to do that at least every time he stands up over the rest of this Parliament, but I could well be proved wrong. Often, announcements of additional capital spending are overhyped. We've got used to the same thing being announced again and again and numbers being accumulated to make something that looks sensibly big. But actually, the additional spending plans announced yesterday were reasonably significant. They'll take public sector net investment to around 2.3% of national income. That's pretty much exactly the last Labour government's pre-crisis plan level investment and well above the average for the last 30 years. And then there are the new fiscal rules. So rather than aiming for budget balance in 2019-20, Mr. Hammond is happy borrowing 2% of national income. That's about £40 billion. Remember that at the last election, the Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls said he was aiming to balance the current budget by 2018-19, i.e. to borrow to invest, i.e. to borrow about 2% of national income. So to misquote Michael Heseltine, it wouldn't be far from the truth to say the new fiscal plans aren't Osborne's, they're Balls. Mr. Hammond then wants to get to budget balance at some point in the next Parliament. Now that sounds a bit woolly. Given uncertain times, though, I think a degree of woolliness is probably sensible. And on the whole, this probably makes a fair stab at getting an appropriate balance between providing us with some kind of clear fiscal direction, which, given all the other uncertainty around, we certainly need, and enough flexibility in the face of uncertainty. That said, it wouldn't take a huge downgrade in trend growth forecasts of GDP in 2020 for us still even to miss this looser target. And don't forget, getting to balance in the next Parliament, which he said he clearly wants to do, will still require a pretty significant additional dollop of austerity into the next Parliament after a full decade's worth we'll have had by then. So that's the overall public spending or public finances. What about tax and spending measures? Well, there's not a terribly long list of anything very substantive. In fact, as I said, there's a growing list of policies announced in previous fiscal events which are being more or less quietly abandoned. More evidence, perhaps, of the case against two fiscal events. But let me just say a couple of words about some of the announcements. First, actually pretty much the biggest, was yet another freezing of fuel duty. It's one of the most expensive things that the Chancellor announced yesterday, and as he said, that's the 7th year. He said rather proudly, it seemed to me, it's the 7th year in a row this has happened. But the problem is, if the policy is never to increase fuel duty, which seems to be the case, why don't we just say that that's the policy rather than every year, as has happened every year, the policy has been we're going to increase it with inflation next year, and then we decide not to. This is turning into a big problem for the Treasury in terms of future fuel duty revenues. Fuel duty is a big chunk of the public finances, and it's also a big problem for our taxation of motoring in terms of the externalities that motoring create. We're going to have a serious look at how we tax motoring going forward. Now, the cost of that fuel duty freeze is near enough offset by the increase in the insurance premium tax. Now, Mr. Hammond wasn't guilty of too many what I might call fiscal infelicities yesterday, but the way in which he announced the increase to insurance premium tax was one. It's half the rate of VAT, he said, as if in explanation of the rise. Well, so it should be. In fact, it should be quite a lot lower than VAT. It's only the value of the insurance, that's the difference between the premiums and the payouts, that you should think in principle should be subject to VAT. So one should think of an insurance premium tax of a lot less than 10%, not more than 10% as the appropriate level. Third, he did announce some changes affecting certain benefits in kind. They were much more meagre than I think we'd been led to believe. They affect only a really very small number of very specific salary sacrifice arrangements. They don't get at all at the continuing issue of the highly beneficial national insurance treatment of many non-cash benefits. I want to, if you'd indulge me, a quick word on an announcement the Chancellor had no proposals on, but which he promised to review and consult upon, and that's the taxation of different ways of working. The OBR has yet again highlighted concerns over increasing levels of incorporation. That's people declaring themselves to be companies rather than employees or self-employed, in terms of undermining the tax base, because you pay less tax if you're incorporated than if you're employed or self-employed. The basic problem is the tax system treats income quite differently according to whether it's earned by an employee, a self-employed person, or a company. And there are some pretty fundamental issues here about the design of the tax system right at the centre of that issue in terms of how we tax different forms of income. So we look forward to being consulted. Luckily, we've thought quite hard about it, and if you want to find out what we thought, you can read these two splendid volumes, the Merleys Review. And actually, that issue is probably the toughest thing we dealt with in these two rather fat volumes. And finally, in terms of the particular issue measures, there was one small offer to the jams. That was a cut in the taper rate for universal credit from 65% to 63%. This is a small increase in generosity relative to the cuts announced last year. My colleagues will explain it in more detail. But I think the important point is we should not forget, we should not allow the growing absurdity of the policy-making process around universal credit to be lost. It is completely ludicrous. So the benefit was announced in 2010, which might be rolled out by 2020, several years late. And detailed changes to its future design have been made in fiscal statement after fiscal statement after fiscal statement, apparently at chancellorial whim, and essentially aimed at balancing the budget several years forward. There is a rational process to go through to design a benefit like this, of which one part is the trade-off between lower work allowances, like was announced last year, and a lower taper rate, which is announced this year. But what we've not seen, what we've not had, is anything like a rational process. This is not how to design and introduce the biggest reform to our welfare system in decades. Let me finish by talking about living standards. As far as the measures announced yesterday are concerned, the answer is what effect did they have on living standards? Not a lot. I mean, really very little. They pale into insignificance alongside the benefit and tax credit cuts announced last year, not to mention increases in the personal allowance and other tax increases implemented since 2010. However, according to the OBR, the outlook for living standards as a whole has deteriorated rather sharply since March. The OBR is forecasting lower nominal wage growth as a result of lower productivity and higher inflation resulting from the exchange rate depreciation. So overall, their view is that real average earnings will rise by less than 5% between now and 2021. So over 5 years, real earnings growing by less than 5%. That means they'll be 3.7% lower in 2021 than the OBR projected in March. To put it another way around, half of the wage growth projected for the next 5 years back in March is not now projected to happen. And on those projections, real wages will still be below their 2008 level. in 2021. I can't stress enough how extraordinary and dreadful that is. To have more than a decade with no real wage growth is certainly something we haven't seen in the last 70 years and quite possibly in the last 100. In addition, the projections imply that the real value of the national living wage will still rise by 20%, but it would have risen by 25% without these changes in forecast, while out-of-work benefits like job seekers allowance will now fall more because they're frozen by nearer 8% than 7.7% rather than 6.5%. Overall, despite some of the headlines, I think we can count the OBR as having been modestly upbeat relative to some other forecasters. Even so, the outlook for living standards and public finances has deteriorated over the last 9 months. Mr. Hammond has responded by increasing capital spending and hence increasing borrowing further. His new fiscal rules, being more relaxed than those of his predecessor, allow him this luxury. And given the still very considerable uncertainties of the direction of the economy, he may well find he needs all the headroom he's left himself. And given that uncertainty, it seems right to me that this autumn statement very much had, for me at least, the feeling of a wait-and-see fiscal event. And to return where I started, we'll also wait and see whether this really is the last autumn statement. We've been here before. Kenneth Clarke also moved from a separate autumn statement and spring budget to a single autumn budget. And actually, we wrote about this in Fiscal Studies back in 1993. Someone called Stephen Dorrell wrote for us, in fact, and someone called Andrew Dilnott. There's even an article in there by someone called Paul Johnson. That didn't survive the change in occupancy in number 11. Let's hope that Mr. Hammond's changes do survive both himself and his successor. I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues who have been beavering away all night putting together some reasonably attractive presentations. You're going to...
Well, that there, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson, giving a somewhat gloomy, some would say, reaction to the autumn statement that the Chancellor delivered yesterday, talking about the fact that British workers face the dreadful prospect of more than a decade without any real growth in their earnings. Quite a gloomy outlook, although he did say towards the end that he was relatively upbeat. Let's just bring in our economics editor, Ed Conway. Is the IFS being Eeyore here, Ed?
Well, I think they're slightly gloomier than normal because from their perspective, there isn't quite as much to say as normal. Now, normally, it's their job after there's been a budget or an autumn statement, and we're kind of, that's where you can see the pictures coming from at the moment, to go through all the books and work out just how much these tax changes affect people, whether extra spending cuts are going to affect people as well. So they kind of toss up the figures, work out whether it all adds up. But in this case, there wasn't an awful lot of new fiscal stuff in yesterday's autumn statement to look at. I mean, certainly there was extra spending on infrastructure, but in terms of tax changes, in terms of spending changes, there really wasn't very much at all. And the big story was actually more an economic one. It was a more question of just how bad does the OBR think the economy is going to get in the future, or indeed good, and it told us that it thought it was going to weaken, and what's the impact there for families. So there's two kind of questions there. There's an economic question of how the economy is doing. Then there's a kind of fiscal question about the impact that's going to have on the public finances. And I think, the IFS would like to look at that a little bit. But what we probably won't get is much of a sense that there have been big tax changes yesterday which will change life for all of us, because, of course, there haven't. It's really just that we got the new sense from the OBR about the state of the economy over the course of the next few years. I think another thing that will be interesting to look at is just whether the IFS think it was that these new fiscal rules that Philip Hammond has are credible at all. I mean, he got rid of George Osborne's old fiscal rules, 3 of them. He's replaced them with rules which by most standards look a bit flimsy. And the IFS might be an interesting authority to say whether they're concerned about that. After all, they look at the state of the public finances, and they might be able to kind of pass judgment on that. One thing certainly, though, that we can say, and this comes both from what we just heard there from Paul Johnson, but also from the Resolution Foundation, another body which has been looking at the impacts, not just of the autumn statement, but of previous decisions by the government during this Parliament. And they say that largely we are still living under the cloud of that benefits freeze announced by George Osborne. Of course, it wasn't pulled back by Philip Hammond. He made some small changes to universal credit generosity, making it slightly more generous. But that is dwarfed by the scale of cuts and the scale of the freeze on people's benefits that they're likely to see over the next few years. And for many families, that means that they will be hard hit by this, particularly those who are in the poorest 10 and 20% of the population.
OK, Ed, thanks very much.
An independent analysis of the autumn statement has shown that workers will earn less in real wages in 2021 than they did back in 2008. Our economics editor, Ed Conway, has been looking at the claims made by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Ed.
Yeah, let me talk you through some of the stuff that we've been hearing about from the IFS today. There's quite a lot of it, actually, but it's rather interesting just to kind of dig through what we learned from the Chancellor and indeed from the autumn statement. And one of those key points is that the essential forecast for the UK economy is a lot weaker than it was last time around. Basically, that's the gap between what we had last time and what we have this time around, and this is the line to be looking at. But the key thing, and that basically is showing you growth over the course of the next few years, the key thing to note is the fact that, look, it is actually a lot stronger than what the Bank of England has been forecasting for the UK economy. So when you compare those two lines, actually, a lot of people have been saying the OBR, the government forecaster, have been a little bit too pessimistic. Actually, they're a bit more optimistic than the Bank of England when you compare those two lines. That's from the IFS, that they're going through their kind of analysis at the moment. As well as that, we're learning that they are planning to borrow, because of their new, slightly more lax fiscal rules, they are planning to borrow, it's this dotted line you're looking at, they're planning to borrow a little bit more than the UK would have been borrowing under Labour, which is rather remarkable when you think about it, isn't it? Given that it was Labour that was attacked by the Conservatives for having the most lax fiscal plans at the time of the last election. So they're borrowing more. Growth forecast not quite as bad as some others expect. But what we do know is that the national debt is heading up to almost record levels. When you see it there, you just see just how stark it is. UK national debt heading for a rate of about kind of 90% of GDP. It looks like that's kind of big in the historical sweep of things, doesn't it? But let's take this, so remember this line, and let's kind of go a little further back. And this is, again, another IFS chart. Look, that's the line that we were looking at just a moment ago, just over here. And you can see that in historical terms, it's nowhere near as big as we saw during the World Wars. It's nowhere near as big as we saw during the Napoleonic Wars as well. The UK has had higher national debt than this many times before in its history, and that's kind of one of the points they make. Not saying that we should be going up to levels of 250% of GDP, but nonetheless saying that it could be a little bit higher. The other kind of issue, though, that certainly has been talked about, both by the IFS and actually also by the Resolution Foundation, they're another think tank that look at this stuff, is this real earnings. And this is basically showing you the 10-yearly rate at which our real earnings, so basically take your wages, take away inflation, are rising at. And have a look at where we are there. The 10-yearly rate going down to the lowest level since around 1910 or so. The IFS making a similar point today because the economy is going to be growing more weakly, because inflation is going to be higher, because wages won't be particularly high in the next few years. Based on these autumn statement numbers, people won't necessarily be feeling the benefit. They'll be feeling a squeeze and will be getting down to those kind of levels. They talk about the worst since 70 years, but really, historical lows there for real wages. And then when you kind of take the distributional analysis, this is basically looking across the income spectrum, all the way from the poorest, you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen, through to the richest, and who benefits the most. Basically, anything in that direction means you're getting poorer as a result of the policies that have been enacted both in the last budget and the autumn statement. And you can see that most of this is actually hitting the poorest, and that's because of the benefits freeze. I mean, really, there wasn't much. These red bits, and this again is from the Resolution Foundation, the red bits is what we got yesterday. This blue stuff is what we got in the last Parliament, and that is mainly the benefits squeeze. People getting worse off because their benefits have been frozen, and that's going to be even worse when, indeed, inflation rises, as some people expect it to. Final thing, and this is really striking, when you look at the state of the UK economy over the course of the past few years, and look at how much people are earning, but divide it by age groups. So, for instance, you've got 22 to 30-year-olds down here at the bottom. You can see that they are 7% worse off in real incomes terms than they were back in 2008, while the oldest, so 60 plus, are 11% better off it shows you that beneath this kind of picture, this overall picture of real earnings, we tend to look at this, the average across age groups. But when you divide it up and look at the old versus the young, this is one of the big intergenerational stories of the UK economy, and we'll be talking about that for quite some time.
Ed, thanks very much.
I've been